Picture this. It's 200 BC somewhere in the caves near the Dead Sea. A scribe carefully wraps an ancient manuscript in linen, sealing away words so dangerous that religious authorities would spend the next 2,000 years trying to bury them. What was in those scrolls? A story of angels who abandoned heaven, not for pride, but for lust. Angels who mated with human women and spawned a race of giants so monstrous that God himself had to flood the entire world to stop them.
Wait, are you telling me there's a biblical text that basically reads like ancient alien fan fiction?
Oh, Kevin. If only it were that simple. This is the Book of Enoch, and the question that haunts scholars, theologians, and conspiracy theorists alike is this: why was a book that was once considered scripture by early Christians completely erased from the Bible? What secrets were too explosive for the faithful to know? Welcome to Dark Dive, the strange, hidden, and untold. I'm Vera.
And I'm Kevin, your resident skeptic who's about to have his worldview shaken by ancient texts about cosmic horniness.
Today we're diving into one of history's most controversial religious manuscripts, a book so scandalous that it was deemed unfit for the Bible, yet so important that pieces of it are actually quoted in the New Testament. We're talking about forbidden knowledge, suppressed history, and the question of whether humanity's darkest chapters were orchestrated by beings from above.
All right, before we get into Angels Gone Wild, give me some context here. What exactly is the Book of Enoch?
So remember Enoch from the Bible? He gets like 2 sentences. Genesis says he was the great-grandfather of Noah and that he walked with God and then just disappeared. The Bible says God took him, implying he was taken up to heaven without dying.
Right, the guy who basically got the ultimate divine Uber ride.
Exactly. But what if I told you there's an entire book, multiple books actually, that claim to be Enoch's first-hand account of what he saw in heaven? And what he saw was disturbing.
Define disturbing.
We're talking about a cosmic rebellion that makes Lucifer's fall look like a minor workplace disagreement. The Book of Enoch tells the story of 200 angels called Watchers, who were supposed to, watch over humanity. Instead, they became obsessed with human women and decided to abandon their heavenly duties for earthly pleasures.
Okay, so we've got horny angels. That's not what I expected from ancient religious texts.
But here's what makes this really significant, Kevin. This wasn't some fringe cult writing. Fragments of the Book of Enoch were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, meaning it was widely read by Jewish communities around 200 BC. Early Christians knew about it too. The New Testament Book of Jude actually quotes from Enoch directly, treating it as legitimate prophecy.
Wait, so there are actual Bible verses that quote from this banned book?
Jude chapter 1, verses 14 to 15 quotes Enoch's prophecy about divine judgment almost word for word, which raises the question, if the New Testament authors thought Enoch was worth quoting, why isn't it in our Bible today?
That's actually a really good point. What happened?
That's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean potentially conspiratorial. But first, let me tell you what this book actually says happened before the flood. Because it's not just about forbidden romance, it's about forbidden knowledge that changed the course of human civilization. So picture the world before Noah's flood. According to Enoch, humanity is still relatively innocent, living simple lives. But up in heaven, there's trouble brewing among the Watchers, these angels whose job it is to observe and guide humanity from a distance.
Like celestial security guards.
Exactly. But these security guards start developing unprofessional feelings. The leader of this rebellion is an angel named Shemihaza, and he's got his eye on human women. But he's smart enough to know that if he acts alone, he'll be the only one punished.
So what does he do?
He organizes a conspiracy. He goes to 199 other angels and basically says, look, we all want the same thing. Let's make a pact. We all fall together, or none of us fall at all. And they take an oath on Mount Hermon, binding themselves to this cosmic mutiny.
Mount Hermon. Isn't that a real place?
It absolutely is. It's on the border between Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. And according to Enoch, that's ground zero for the event that would doom the antediluvian world.
Antediluvian, meaning before the flood?
Right. So these 200 angels descend from heaven, take human wives, and the result is, well, it's not exactly a fairy tale romance. Their offspring are called the Nephilim, and according to Enoch, these weren't just unusually tall people. We're talking about giants of impossible proportions. The text says some were 3,000 cubits high,
How tall is that in normal measurements?
about 4,500 feet tall, Kevin.
What? That's like, that's a mountain with legs.
I know, it sounds absurd. But stick with me because the story gets darker. These giants weren't just big, they were insatiably hungry. Enoch describes how they devoured all of humanity's food supply, and when that ran out, they turned cannibalistic. They began eating people, animals, birds, basically everything that moved.
So we've gone from forbidden love to kaiju monsters terrorizing the ancient world.
But that's not even the worst part. See, the Watchers didn't just father monsters, they also became teachers. And what they taught humanity would change everything.
What kind of teachings are we talking about?
This is where it gets really controversial. According to Enoch, an angel named Azazel taught humans how to make weapons: swords, knives, shields, armor, basically the technology of war. Other angels taught the arts of seduction, cosmetics, jewelry, how to beautify the eyes with makeup.
Wait, so makeup was considered forbidden knowledge?
From this perspective, yes, but it gets weirder. Some angels taught humans about herbs and medicine, others about astrology and divination. Essentially, many of the advances we consider hallmarks of civilization: metallurgy, medicine, astronomy, even cosmetics, Enoch attributes to fallen angels.
That's actually a fascinating way to think about technological progress. Like, what if our advancement came from outside influence rather than natural human development?
Right? And here's what makes this story so subversive. It suggests that human evil isn't entirely our fault. We were corrupted by external forces, taught forbidden arts before we were spiritually mature enough to handle them.
I can see why religious authorities might have problems with that interpretation. It kind of lets humans off the hook.
Exactly, but the story doesn't end with education. As violence and depravity spread across the earth, thanks to the new weapons and the marauding giants, the good angels in heaven start to take notice.
The good angels? So there was like a celestial civil war brewing?
In a sense, yes. The archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, see what's happening and bring humanity's cries for help before God himself. And God's response is decisive.
How decisive are we talking?
He orders the Watchers to be bound in chains and imprisoned in dark pits until the final judgment. But their giant offspring, they can't be imprisoned because they're mortal. So God decides to wipe them out with a global flood.
So in Enoch's telling, the Noah flood wasn't just about general human wickedness. It was specifically about stopping these hybrid monsters?
That's right. The flood becomes a targeted purge, a reset button to cleanse the earth of angelic contamination. But here's the really chilling part.
There's more?
According to Enoch, when the giants died in the flood, their spirits didn't just disappear. They became demons, evil spirits that roamed the earth, seeking to possess and torment humanity. So essentially, the demons that plague the world today, they're the ghosts of the Nephilim.
That's actually a pretty terrifying origin story for evil. So, every demon is basically the angry spirit of a drowned giant seeking revenge?
That's the implication. And if you think about it, it creates this continuous thread of corruption. The original rebellion of the Watchers echoes through history in the form of demonic influence, keeping humanity trapped in cycles of violence and depravity. But Kevin, we've only scratched the surface of why this book was considered so dangerous, because the Book of Enoch doesn't just tell this story, it claims to reveal the future as well.
All right, so we've got this wild story about angel-human hybrids and the origin of demons. But you mentioned prophecies, too. What kind of future did Enoch claim to see?
This is where things get really interesting for early Christians. The Book of Enoch contains detailed descriptions of a coming Messiah, a figure called the Son of Man, who will sit on a throne of glory and judge the wicked.
That sounds very familiar.
Right? Some of the language in Enoch's messianic prophecies is strikingly similar to what Jesus says about himself in the Gospels. In fact, some scholars think early Christians may have drawn from Enochic traditions when writing about Christ.
So, wait, are you suggesting that Christian theology was influenced by this banned book?
It's possible, but here's where it gets politically complicated. According to early church father Tertullian, Jewish authorities rejected the Book of Enoch specifically because it contained prophecies about Christ.
Oh, so it became a religious hot potato. Nobody wanted to deal with it.
Exactly. Jews didn't like it because it seemed to support Christian messianism. Christians eventually backed away from it because, well, there are several theories about that.
Before you get into those theories, I want to understand something. You mentioned this book was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's a pretty big deal, right? I mean, those scrolls are considered one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century.
Absolutely. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered between 1946 and 1956 in caves near Qumran, and they completely revolutionized our understanding of Second Temple Judaism. Among those scrolls, archaeologists found fragments of multiple copies of Enochic literature.
Multiple copies suggests it was pretty popular with whoever was living at Qumran.
Exactly. The Qumran community, probably the Essenes, a Jewish sect, seem to have treasured these texts. But here's what's fascinating. While they preserved Enoch, the mainstream Jewish authorities in Jerusalem were moving in the opposite direction.
So there was already a split in how different Jewish groups viewed this text.
Right. And that split gives us insight into the religious politics of the time. The Essenes were an apocalyptic sect. They believed they were living in the end times and that God would soon intervene dramatically in human history. The Book of Enoch, with its visions of cosmic judgment and messianic prophecy, fit perfectly with their worldview.
But the mainstream Jewish authorities had different priorities?
They were focused on practical concerns: how to maintain Jewish identity under Roman occupation, how to interpret Torah law, how to worship without the temple after it was destroyed in 70 CE. The fantastical cosmology of Enoch probably seemed like a distraction from these urgent matters.
That makes sense. When you're trying to survive cultural extinction, you probably don't have time for stories about giant angel babies.
But here's where it gets complicated for early Christians. The New Testament clearly shows knowledge of Enochic traditions, not just the direct quote in Jude, but conceptual parallels in other books. The idea of Satan and his angels being bound in chains until the final judgment, which appears in 2 Peter and Revelation, echoes Enoch's account of the Watchers being imprisoned.
So even if they didn't include the full text, they were still influenced by its ideas?
That's the scholarly consensus. But it creates a puzzle. If early Christians found Enoch's ideas useful, why didn't they preserve the full text?
Lay them on me.
Theory number one: by the 4th and 5th centuries, Christian theology was moving away from the idea that angels could have physical bodies and procreate. The notion of angel-human hybrids started to seem crude and incompatible with a more sophisticated understanding of angelic nature,
So it became theologically embarrassing?
in a sense. Theory number two is more political. The Book of Enoch shifts blame for human evil onto external supernatural forces. But the church wanted to emphasize human free will and moral responsibility. If evil came from outside corruption, it complicated the narrative of personal sin and redemption.
That makes sense. It's easier to sell personal salvation if people are responsible for their own problems.
But here's theory number three, and this is where the conspiracy-minded folks get excited. What if the book was suppressed because it contained information that certain authorities didn't want widely known?
What kind of information?
Well, think about what the Watchers taught humanity: advanced metallurgy, medicine, astronomy, warfare. In an ancient alien theory context, some people interpret this as evidence that human civilization was jump-started by non-human intelligence.
So instead of angels, they're thinking extraterrestrials?
Some do, yes. The idea is that ancient peoples interpreted contact with advanced beings as divine visitation. The angels were actually alien visitors who interbred with humans and shared advanced technology.
That's actually not the craziest theory I've heard. I mean, if you're a Bronze Age human and you encounter beings with advanced technology, You might very well think they were gods or angels.
Right. And the giants could be explained as hybrid offspring or genetic experiments. The forbidden knowledge becomes advanced scientific information that primitive humans weren't ready for.
But that still doesn't explain why religious authorities would want to hide it. Unless,
Unless what?
unless there's more to the story than what's in the ancient texts. Are there modern claims about this stuff?
Oh, Kevin, you have no idea. There are people who claim that giant skeletons have been discovered and then covered up by institutions like the Smithsonian. In the early 2000s, photos circulated online allegedly showing archaeological teams uncovering enormous human remains.
Let me guess. They turned out to be fake?
Completely fabricated. Reuters and National Geographic fact checkers traced the images back to Photoshop contests. But the believers weren't deterred. They claimed the debunking itself is part of the cover up. I think it comes down to a deep psychological need for meaning and agency. People want to believe that there are explanations for why the world feels chaotic or unfair. The idea that there's a hidden history, that powerful institutions are suppressing truth, gives people a sense that they're part of some larger narrative.
It makes them the heroes of their own conspiracy thriller.
Exactly. But there's something else at play here, Kevin. The Book of Enoch taps into anxieties that are surprisingly modern. Think about it. We're living in an age where technology advances faster than our ability to understand its implications, where we're worried about genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, environmental collapse.
And Enoch's story is basically about advanced beings giving humans technology they weren't ready for, leading to catastrophic consequences.
Right. It's the same cautionary tale, just dressed in ancient garb. The Watchers teaching humans metallurgy and warfare is like a Bronze Age version of our fears about AI development or genetic manipulation. The giants devouring everything in sight sounds a lot like our anxieties about unsustainable consumption and environmental destruction.
That's actually pretty profound. So maybe these ancient stories survive because they're addressing timeless human concerns?
But here's where it gets even more interesting. There are modern religious movements that have embraced the Book of Enoch as legitimate scripture. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never stopped treating it as part of the Bible, and there are growing communities of believers worldwide who think mainstream Christianity made a mistake by excluding it.
What do they believe specifically?
Some believe we're living in the end times that Enoch prophesied, and that the Watchers are about to be released from their prison. Others think the Nephilim bloodlines survived the flood and are still active today. They point to unusually tall people or claims about elite bloodlines as evidence.
So they're saying there are still giants among us?
Not necessarily giants in the literal sense, but the idea that certain families or groups carry Nephilim DNA and use it to maintain power over regular humans. It's conspiracy theory meets biblical prophecy.
That takes the story in a very different direction than ancient alien theories.
It does. And then there are the people who interpret everything through a modern supernatural lens. They see reports of UFO encounters, alien abductions, cattle mutilations, and they say, this isn't extraterrestrial, this is the same spiritual warfare that Enoch described.
So instead of aliens, they're demons?
According to this view, yes. The gray aliens that abductees describe are actually demonic entities, the spirits of the dead Nephilim that Enoch said would roam the earth. The genetic experiments that abductees report are attempts by these entities to once again corrupt human DNA.
That's actually a cleverly updated mythology. It takes modern phenomena and fits them into an ancient framework.
But it also reveals something interesting about human psychology. Whether we're talking about fallen angels, ancient aliens, or demonic entities, all these theories have one thing in common. They assume that human beings have been manipulated by non-human intelligence.
We're never just the authors of our own story.
Right. And maybe that's what makes the Book of Enoch so persistently appealing. It offers an explanation for evil that doesn't require us to take full responsibility. The world is messed up because we were corrupted by external forces, not because of inherent human flaws.
That's actually kind of comforting in a weird way.
But there's another modern interpretation that's less science fiction, and more sociological. Some scholars think the Enoch story was actually ancient commentary on cultural contamination.
How so?
The Book of Enoch was written during the Hellenistic period, when Jewish culture was under pressure from a Greek influence. The forbidden knowledge taught by the Watchers, things like cosmetics, divination, advanced weaponry, these were all associated with Greek civilization.
So the fallen angels might represent foreign cultural influence?
Right. The story could be a metaphor about the dangers of adopting foreign practices too quickly, about losing cultural and religious identity in the face of more sophisticated but potentially corrupting outside influences.
That's actually a really grounded interpretation. It makes the whole thing less about literal giants and more about cultural anxiety.
But even if you accept the metaphorical reading, it raises questions about why this particular text was singled out for exclusion. After all, the Bible contains plenty of other culturally specific material that made it into the canon.
So what made Enoch different?
That's the million-dollar question, Kevin. And to answer it, we need to look at what the skeptics and mainstream scholars have to say.
All right, time for some reality checks. What do mainstream scholars actually think about all this?
The scholarly consensus is pretty clear. The Book of Enoch is a work of creative theological fiction, not a historical account. It was written by multiple unknown authors during the Second Temple period, roughly 3rd to 1st century BCE, not by the biblical Enoch who supposedly lived before the flood.
So it's essentially biblical fan fiction?
That's not far off, actually. It's what scholars call pseudepigrapha, false attribution. Ancient writers would claim their works were written by famous figures from the past to give them more authority.
Which explains why no serious scholar thinks the actual Enoch wrote it.
Right. And when you look at the content through a critical lens, the problems become obvious. The astronomical observations in Enoch reflect knowledge that wasn't available in antediluvian times, but was common in the Hellenistic period. The theological concepts show Greek philosophical influence.
So it's anachronistic?
Exactly. It's like finding a medieval manuscript that mentions gunpowder and claiming it was written by King Arthur. The details give away the real time period.
But let's talk about this from another angle. Even if we accept that it's not literally written by Enoch, does that automatically invalidate everything in it? I mean, most biblical scholars don't think Moses literally wrote all of the Torah, but that doesn't mean they dismiss it entirely.
That's a fair point, Kevin. Authorship and historical accuracy are different questions from literary and theological value. But here's where Enoch runs into problems even from a non-literal perspective.
What kind of problems?
Well, let's look at the flood narrative. Enoch presents the flood as a response specifically to the Watchers' corruption and the violence of the Nephilim. But if you read Genesis carefully, it doesn't actually blame the flood on the giants.
What does it blame it on?
Genesis 6:5 says, God saw that human wickedness had become great, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. It's a more general indictment of human moral failure, not specifically about hybrid giants.
So Enoch is essentially adding a supernatural explanation to a story that was originally about human responsibility?
That's one way to read it. And that interpretive difference has huge theological implications. If evil comes from external corruption, fallen angels teaching forbidden knowledge, then humans are partly victims. But if evil comes from human choices, then we bear full moral responsibility.
I can see why that would make religious authorities uncomfortable. It complicates the whole framework of sin and salvation.
Exactly. And there's another issue, the text's treatment of knowledge itself. In Enoch, learning metallurgy, medicine, and astronomy are presented as inherently corrupting. But in mainstream Jewish and Christian thought, knowledge and wisdom are generally seen as gifts from God.
So the book is kind of anti-intellectual?
In some ways, yes. It presents technological and scientific advancement as spiritually dangerous. That's a perspective that might have made sense to people who felt overwhelmed by rapid cultural change, but it sits uncomfortably with traditions that value learning and discovery.
What about the physical evidence, the giant skeletons and all that?
There is none. Every alleged discovery of giant remains has been debunked. The viral photos from the 2000s were traced back to digital art contests. The largest human skeletons ever found are from individuals with medical conditions like gigantism, but nothing approaching the scale described in Enoch.
And the flood narrative?
Geological evidence shows no global flood in human times. There were regional flooding events, the Black Sea deluge, various Mesopotamian floods, but nothing that submerged all continents simultaneously.
So the scientific evidence doesn't support the literal interpretation?
Not at all. But here's what's interesting: the lack of physical evidence doesn't necessarily invalidate the cultural and psychological importance of these stories.
What do you mean?
Well, even if the Watchers and Nephilim are mythological, they represent something real about human experience. Our fascination with the forbidden, our anxiety about corruption and change, our desire to understand where evil comes from.
So the stories might be psychologically true, even if they're not historically accurate.
That's one way to look at it. Carl Jung would probably say the Watchers represent archetypal patterns in the human unconscious. Joseph Campbell might frame it as part of the universal hero's journey mythology.
But that still doesn't explain why this particular myth was excluded from the Bible when others weren't.
And that's where we get into the really interesting territory, because the exclusion might not have been about the content being too fantastic. After all, the canonical Bible has talking serpents, parting seas, and people rising from the dead.
So what made Enoch different?
I think it comes down to theological control. The Book of Enoch presents a cosmology where human beings are caught between competing supernatural forces, where our choices matter, but they're constrained by the ongoing influence of angelic rebellion and demonic spirits.
That's a more complex narrative than simple good versus evil.
Right? And complex narratives are harder for institutions to manage. It's easier to maintain religious authority when you can present clear, moral choices rather than explaining cosmic conflicts that began before human history.
So the suppression might have been more about institutional control than doctrinal purity?
That's certainly possible. But we're venturing into speculative territory here. The fact is, we may never know exactly why some communities preserved Enoch while others abandoned it. So where does that leave us, Kevin? We started with the question of why the Book of Enoch was excluded from the Bible and what explosive secrets it might contain.
And what's the answer?
Maybe the real explosive secret isn't about giants or fallen angels. Maybe it's about the nature of religious authority itself. The Book of Enoch survived for over 2,000 years despite official suppression. It was preserved in Ethiopian Christianity, rediscovered by Western scholars, and now it's more widely read than ever thanks to the internet.
So the attempt to suppress it actually backfired?
In a way, yes. By excluding it from the canon, religious authorities inadvertently made it more intriguing. The forbidden fruit effect. We always want what we're told we can't have.
But that raises another question. If these stories are so compelling, if they address fundamental human anxieties about good and evil, knowledge and corruption, why shouldn't they be part of religious discourse?
That's exactly the question, isn't it? Whether you interpret the Watchers as literal angels, ancient aliens, or metaphors for cultural contamination, they represent something that resonates with people across centuries and cultures.
The fear that we're not in control of our own destiny.
Or the hope that someone else is responsible when things go wrong. Either way, it's a story that refuses to die, despite 2 millennia of official disapproval.
Which brings us back to that scribe in the Dead Sea caves, carefully preserving words that authorities wanted forgotten.
And here's the thing that keeps me up at night. What if he wasn't just preserving mythology? What if these stories encode actual memories, not of literal giants and angels, but of contact with beings or civilizations that were advanced beyond their time?
You mean like a cultural memory of encountering a more advanced human civilization that was later destroyed?
Or contact with something genuinely non-human that was interpreted through the mythological framework available at the time. The question isn't whether 4,500-foot giants existed, but whether the people who told these stories were trying to preserve some kind of encounter with the unknown.
That's actually more unsettling than the literal interpretation.
Because it suggests that the suppression wasn't about protecting us from fantasy, but from uncomfortable truths about human history that we're not ready to confront.
But even if that's true, how would we ever prove it? I mean, we're talking about events that supposedly happened thousands of years ago. interpreted through ancient worldviews, and filtered through multiple layers of translation and transmission.
That's the maddening thing about investigating ancient mysteries, Kevin. The further back you go, the hazier everything becomes. But sometimes the haziness itself is significant.
What do you mean?
Think about it. If the Book of Enoch really was just pure mythology, why did so many different groups find it compelling enough to preserve? The Qumran community, early Christians, Ethiopian Orthodox believers, medieval scholars, modern conspiracy theorists. There's this persistent thread of interest that spans cultures and centuries.
You're saying the durability of the story suggests there might be something real at its core?
I'm saying it's worth asking why certain myths have staying power while others fade away. The stories that survive tend to be the ones that address fundamental human experiences or concerns. They might not be literally true, but they capture something psychologically or spiritually authentic.
Like the way fairy tales endure because they address universal themes about growing up, facing danger, or finding your place in the world.
Exactly. But the Book of Enoch tackles themes that are particularly relevant to our current moment. The relationship between knowledge and wisdom, the unintended consequences of technological advancement, the question of human agency versus external influence.
And the fear that progress might not always be progress.
Right. When Enoch describes the Watchers teaching humans metallurgy that leads to warfare or cosmetics that lead to vanity and deception, it's addressing anxieties about whether human advancement is truly beneficial.
That sounds surprisingly contemporary. We have similar debates about social media, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence.
Which might explain why interest in the Book of Enoch has exploded in recent decades. People are looking for frameworks to understand technological change that feels overwhelming or potentially dangerous.
So even if the literal story is false, the underlying concerns are real and timeless.
That's one way to approach it. But here's what bothers me. If these are just universal human concerns dressed up in mythological language, why was this particular text singled out for exclusion while other mythologically rich biblical books were preserved?
You mean like Genesis, which has talking serpents, and a man living inside a fish?
Exactly. The Bible is full of fantastic elements that require symbolic interpretation. So what made Enoch different? I keep coming back to the question of authority. The Book of Enoch presents a cosmology where human beings are caught in the middle of ongoing supernatural conflicts that began before our time and will continue after it.
That's a more complex narrative than most religious institutions want to manage.
Right. It's easier to maintain religious authority when you can present clear moral choices rather than explaining cosmic conflicts that constrain human agency. If people believe they're responsible for their own salvation, they'll look to religious authorities for guidance. But if they believe they're pawns in an angelic chess game,
They might start asking different questions about who's really in charge.
listeners, what do you think? Were the Watchers literal angels, ancient astronauts, or psychological archetypes? Drop your theories in the comments below and let us know if you think there are other lost texts that deserve investigation.
And if this deep dive into forbidden knowledge left you wanting more mysteries, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, we've got plenty more suppressed histories to uncover.
Speaking of suppressed texts, next week we're exploring the lost gospels and hidden teachings. Alternative scriptures like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene that present radically different versions of early Christianity. What if these heretical texts actually preserve the original teachings that mainstream Christianity erased?
Until then, keep questioning everything, especially the things you're told not to question.
This has been Dark Dive, the strange, hidden, and untold. I'm Vera.
And I'm Kevin. Remember, the most dangerous secrets are often hidden in plain sight.
Sweet dreams. And may your giants stay in your mythology, not your reality.